The summer heat pressed down on Manhattan like a heavy blanket, but inside the gilded halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the air was cool and perfect. Marco Santos stood in front of a Monet, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor. He wasn't supposed to be there. His landscaping crew was working on the museum's gardens, but during his lunch break, he'd slipped inside, unable to resist the pull of beauty he'd only seen in books. He was so lost in the painting's water lilies that he didn't notice the young woman beside him until she spoke. "It's Bridge Over a Pond of Water Lilies. He painted it when he was going blind." Her voice was soft but confident, cultured in a way that spoke of private schools and summer homes. Marco turned and felt his breath catch. She was stunning, not in the polished, intimidating way of the women he'd seen in magazine spreads, but in something more genuine. Her auburn hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes held an intelligence that made him forget for a moment the dirt under his fingernails and the grass stains on his work pants. "I didn't know that," Marco replied, finding his voice. "About him going blind, I mean. That makes it even more beautiful, doesn't it? Like he was trying to hold on to the world before it disappeared." The young woman smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "That's a lovely way to put it. I'm Charlotte." She extended her hand, and Marco shook it, acutely aware of how rough his palm must feel against her soft skin. "Marco," he said, "I work in the gardens here." They talked for 20 minutes that felt like 2. Charlotte told him she was taking a gap year before starting at Yale, volunteering at various museums and foundations. She didn't mention that her last name was Ashford, that her family's wealth traced back to railroad tycoons and oil barons, that she lived in a Fifth Avenue penthouse worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. And Marco didn't tell her that he shared a cramped apartment in Queens with 3 cousins, that he sent most of his paycheck back to his mother in Ecuador, that he dropped out of community college because he couldn't afford both tuition and food. They exchanged numbers, and Marco assumed that would be the end of it. Beautiful, educated women like Charlotte didn't date guys like him. But she texted him that evening, asking about his favorite painting. They started meeting for coffee, then walks in Central Park, then dinners at small restaurants in neighborhoods far from her usual haunts. Marco still didn't know who she really was. Charlotte Ashford kept her last name to herself, introduced him to her friends as Charlie, and for a few perfect weeks, she got to be just a girl falling in love. The truth came out on a humid August evening. Marco had saved enough to take Charlotte to a slightly nicer restaurant in the West Village, wanting to impress her. As they walked in, he noticed the maitre d's eyes widen, watched as whispers rippled through the dining room. Charlotte's hand tightened on his arm. "We should go somewhere else," she said quietly, but it was too late. A photographer appeared from nowhere, camera flashing. "Charlotte Ashford, is this your new boyfriend? What does your father think?" The questions came rapid fire as Charlotte pulled Marco out onto the street, her face pale. In a quiet doorway, 3 blocks away, she told him everything. Her family's fortune, estimated at over $12 billion. Her father, Richard Ashford, whose real estate empire stretched across 3 continents. The expectations, the scrutiny, the carefully curated life she'd been trying to escape. "I should have told you," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I was afraid you'd see me differently. That you'd see the money instead of me." Marco stood silent for a long moment, processing. Then he cupped her face in his hands, rough palms against soft cheeks. "I fell in love with the girl who talked about Monet and laughed at my terrible jokes and cried during that street musician's violin solo. That's who you are to me." But the real world had other plans. The photo from the restaurant went viral. By morning, Marco's face was plastered across gossip sites and tabloids. Billionaire heiress slumming it with gardener. Charlotte Ashford's shocking romance. The headlines were cruel and invasive, digging into his background, his family, making him sound like either a gold digger or a charity case. His phone rang constantly with numbers he didn't recognize. Reporters camped outside his apartment building. His boss at the museum called, apologetic but firm. The publicity was too much of a distraction. Marco was let go. Charlotte's father demanded a meeting. Marco went to the Ashford building in Midtown, its glass and steel facade reflecting a distorted version of himself. Richard Ashford's office occupied the entire top floor, with windows overlooking Central Park. The man himself was tall and imposing, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed Marco like a balance sheet. "Mr. Santos," he began, not bothering with pleasantries, "let me be direct. You seem like a decent young man, but you're in over your head. My daughter has responsibilities, expectations, a future that has been carefully planned. You don't fit into that picture." He slid a check across the mahogany desk. Marco didn't even look at it. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Ashford." Richard's smile was thin and humorless. "Everyone has a price. That's $1 million. Enough to change your life, help your family, go back to school. All you have to do is walk away from Charlotte. Cleanly, quietly. Tell her you can't handle the pressure, that it's too different. She'll be hurt, but she'll move on. She always does." Marco stood, his chair scraping against the expensive hardwood. "You don't know your daughter at all, do you? She's not fragile. She's the strongest person I've ever met. And I'm not walking away because you're uncomfortable with who I am." He left the check on the desk. That night, Charlotte showed up at his apartment, eyes red from crying. Her father had given her an ultimatum: end things with Marco or be cut off from the family fortune, removed from all positions in the family businesses, essentially disowned. "He doesn't think I'll do it," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "He thinks I can't survive without the money, without the name. But Marco, I don't want any of it if it means losing you." Marco pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "Charlie, I can't let you do that. Your father's right about one thing. Our worlds are too different. But not in the way he thinks. I can't give you the life you're used to. I can barely afford this apartment. I just lost my job because of us. What kind of future is that?" Charlotte pulled back, her green eyes fierce. "The kind I want. The kind I choose. Don't you dare make this decision for me. I'm not some princess in a tower who needs protecting. I'm a grown woman who knows what she wants. And I want you. I want us. Everything else, we'll figure out." The next few months were the hardest of Marco's life. He found work with a different landscaping company, but the pay was less and the hours longer. Charlotte moved out of her family's penthouse and into a modest studio in Brooklyn, taking a job as a junior curator at a small gallery. They learned to budget, to cook meals at home, to find joy in simple things. Charlotte's former friends stopped calling. Invitations to galas and benefits dried up. The press eventually lost interest, moving on to the next scandal. But something unexpected began to happen. Charlotte, freed from the weight of expectations and her family's influence, flourished. She threw herself into her work at the gallery, discovering a genuine talent for spotting emerging artists and curating compelling exhibitions. Marco, inspired by her courage, enrolled in night classes at community college, studying landscape architecture. They supported each other through exhaustion and doubt, celebrated small victories, built a life that was entirely their own. One evening, almost a year after that first meeting at the Met, they were walking home from a late movie when Charlotte stopped suddenly. "My father called today," she said quietly. Marco tensed, but she continued. "He wants to meet with both of us. No ultimatums this time, he promised. Just dinner." Marco was skeptical, but they agreed to go. The restaurant was discreet and expensive, the kind of place where conversations were private, and discretion was guaranteed. Richard Ashford looked older somehow, tired. He greeted them formally, and for several minutes they made awkward small talk. Then Charlotte's father set down his fork and looked directly at Marco. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "I thought you were after my daughter's money. I thought she was being naive, rebellious, but I've had her followed. Don't look at me like that, Charlotte. It's what fathers do. And I've seen how you live, how hard you both work, the life you've built." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth and power, and I thought that was what mattered, that protecting the family fortune was protecting my daughter. But watching you two this past year, I've realized something. Charlotte was never truly happy before she met you. She was playing a role, living the life I designed for her. Now she's become the person she was meant to be." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Her father reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry I tried to buy off the best thing that ever happened to you. I'm sorry I put money before your happiness. Can you forgive me?" The reconciliation wasn't instant or perfect. There were conditions and compromises. Richard couldn't simply hand over the fortune without responsibilities, but he could offer opportunities. He proposed that Charlotte take a position overseeing the Ashford Foundation's arts initiative with complete autonomy and a real salary earned through real work. For Marco, he offered nothing directly, which was exactly what Marco wanted. But he did make a phone call that led to an interview with one of the city's top landscape architecture firms, where Marco's portfolio and vision spoke for themselves. 2 years later, Marco stood in the sculpture garden he'd designed, part of a public park in the Bronx that brought beauty and green space to a neighborhood that desperately needed it. Charlotte stood beside him, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, their first child growing inside her. The garden was filled with people from the neighborhood, families playing, elderly couples walking slowly, teenagers taking selfies among the flowering trees. "This is better than any painting in the Met," Charlotte whispered. Marco kissed her temple. "It's perfect, because it's real. Like us." The wedding, when it came, was small and simple, held in that same sculpture garden with both their families present. Marco's mother, flown in from Ecuador, cried happy tears as she hugged Charlotte. Richard Ashford, who had learned to see wealth in terms of love and purpose rather than dollars and power, welcomed Marco as the son he never had. The press covered it, of course, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer a scandal, but a modern fairy tale. What happened next changed everything, but not in the way people expected. Marco and Charlotte didn't become a famous power couple. They didn't leverage her family connections for social climbing or use his story for inspirational speaking tours. They simply lived, working hard at what they loved, raising their children to understand both privilege and the dignity of honest work, creating beauty wherever they could. Marco's firm grew, specializing in bringing green spaces to underserved communities. Charlotte's foundation became known for supporting emerging artists from diverse backgrounds, giving opportunities to talents who might otherwise be overlooked. Years later, when people asked Charlotte about that summer when she fell in love with a poor boy, she would smile and correct them gently. "He was never poor," she'd say. "He was rich in all the ways that mattered, in integrity, in kindness, in vision. He just didn't have money. There's a difference." And Marco, overhearing, would add with a grin, "And she was never just a rich girl. She was someone brave enough to choose her own path even when it was harder. That's the rarest kind of wealth." Their story became one that parents told their children, not about rags to riches or love conquering all, but about something more nuanced and real, about how true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in courage, in choosing love over fear, in building something meaningful together. It was a story about how sometimes the best things in life come from having the bravery to step outside your world and meet someone else halfway, in the space between what you were and what you could become together. And in the end, That changed everything.